Meanwhile, a group of congressmen in the United States have written a letter to President Donald Trump calling on him to revoke South Africa's preference benefits under AGOA. The congressmen people say this is due to what they say are human rights abuses and South Africa's continued insistence to undermine American security and foreign policy interests. For more on this letter and what it means for the future of South Africa's participation in AGOA, I'm joined by Simon Marks, our United States correspondent. Very good afternoon to you, Simon. Thank you very much for your time. Well, I mean, AGOA is key, to South Africa's trade relationship with the United States. The fact, though, is that the threats of revoking South Africa's AGOA membership precede Donald Trump's re-election.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Vuyo. I mean, there has been hostility towards South Africa among some elements in the United States Congress, and some have been arguing for successive American governments to take a look at South Africa's participation in AGOA. But look, it's a new day here now in the United States, and it is clearly a new dawn in the US-South African bilateral relationship. And the language used in this letter from these four members of Congress to President Donald Trump is extraordinary. This letter was scribed a week ago. It was only released within the last couple of days, so we don't quite understand the gap between the date on the letter, February the 11th, and the date on the public realization that it had been sent. But even the opening line, "The golden age of America has begun," they write. "In a matter of weeks, Mr. President, you have rejuvenated the American spirit." I mean, it certainly sounds like this is a letter designed for an audience of one, really, the President of the United States, Donald Trump. And possibly even, I think one has to wonder whether it was written at the behest of either the White House or some of those influential voices that have been whispering into Donald Trump's ear about the situation in South Africa, and particularly the Expropriation Act. And we should remind viewers that both the White House, the President himself, and the Secretary of State Marco Rubio have misstated what is actually taking place in South Africa under the expropriation law. They say that land is being expropriated, that human rights abuses are being committed via that law, which of course is something that the government in South Africa and other groups very much counter and contradict. But it's also important to underscore that this letter not only uses language about government in Pretoria, calling it, for example, an ethno-nationalist gangster regime, it suggests that the conduct of government led by President Cyril Ramaphosa means that South Africa is no longer committed to the protection of private property rights. And as such, that, they say, is a violation of the US Federal Criminal Code, which means that South Africa would be on its merits ineligible for AGOA renewal because it pierces the requirements for coming under the AGOA umbrella. But even more, I think, concerning from the government's perspective there is the threat that is contained in this letter to suspend diplomatic relations between the United States and South Africa. We would suggest that you consider suspending diplomatic ties, these members of Congress write to President Trump, unless the South African government is prepared to engage constructively with our own. As you know, South Africa's foreign minister says that the embassy here has been trying to engage constructively with the Trump administration over the past 10 days since the onslaught against South Africa first begun here. And they say they simply are getting nowhere, not currently able to secure any attention from senior officials within the Trump administration. But it's not just this letter about potentially pulling South Africa out from AGOA. It's also about the possible suspension of diplomatic ties.
Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa has said he is going to send ministers to address the US's concerns. Do you think they are going to get a receptive audience there?
Well, that's the key question. I mean, the only point of sending ministers is when you know that those ministers are going to be welcomed into meetings. I mean, it would be, I think, futile to come here and not secure meetings with top officials, including potentially the country's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, both of whom, of course, today have their hands full in Saudi Arabia with the conversations that they've been having with Russian emissaries ahead of possible peace talks relating to ending the conflict in Ukraine. I mean, clearly, if the Trump administration is not set to receive on this issue, but is only set to transmit, is not willing to meet South African officials in person here in Washington, D.C., that is going to get very, very complicated indeed. I also just want to underscore, Vuyo, the background to at least one of the figures who has signed this letter, Congressman Andy Ogles. He is the Republican member of Congress who is so pro-Donald Trump that on the first day of the Trump administration, after the inauguration last month, Andy Ogles submitted an effort to amend the United States Constitution in the House of Representatives so that Donald Trump would be allowed to serve, if he wants to, a third term in office. So these are absolutely dyed-in-the-wool supporters of Donald Trump and his Make America Great Again movement. And the language in this letter is so hostile towards Pretoria that one has to wonder whether there's been a response to this letter from President Trump and the White House, and to what extent it actually reflects the viewpoints and policies now of the Trump administration, particularly as we head towards the G20 summit in South Africa in November. Remember that Marco Rubio was supposed to be heading to South Africa right around now for the foreign ministers' preparatory meeting, G20 foreign ministers meeting that's taking place there in a couple of days' time. He decided to boycott that event. Does all of that presage a wider boycott of G20 by the United States? These four members of Congress clearly think that diplomatic ties between the two governments should be suspended, which would be an absolutely astonishing development. It's not something that ever even occurred during the apartheid era.
There are people, of course, who believe that this is all a smokescreen. In reality, the United States is unhappy that South Africa took Israel to the International Court of Justice.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely cited in this letter as well. I mean, all of these assaults on South Africa by the White House, by the State Department, and now by these members of Congress is not only based on the Expropriation Act, it's based on South African foreign policy. It's based on taking Israel to the ICJ. It's based, according to these members of Congress, on the proximity that some supporters of Hamas have, they claim in this letter, even to maintaining organizational structures in South Africa. And of course, it's also based on the warmth of the relationship between Pretoria and Moscow, and the relationship between Pretoria and Beijing. They complain in this letter that government is trying to force Taiwan to withdraw its diplomatic representative office from Pretoria. So all of those issues are cited in this letter as a reason why they argue in their conclusion that South Africa is simply not deserving of duty-free access to the American market. I think it would be a mistake, based on everything that we've seen so far, to think that all of this is just posturing by Donald Trump and the people that support him. This Trump administration, unlike the one 8 years ago, this Trump administration is not being held back by people on the inside who can go to Donald Trump and say, look, you really don't just want to go out there and in front of the world's media announce that the United States is going to take over the Gaza Strip, for example. There's no one to hold him back from the instincts that he has. And if his instincts are those that are contained in this letter and shared with these 4 members of Congress, I think, there is no reason to think that there's anyone within Donald Trump's inner circle who is saying to him, you really sure you want to take South Africa on like this? Are you absolutely sure this is the way you want to go?
Simon Max, we shall see how this all pans out. Simon Max, our U.S. correspondent, on the back, of course, of that letter by 4 U.S. congressmen who are asking Donald Trump to revoke South Africa's access to the U.S. market via AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. The consequences, of course, will be dire for our economy. The consequences will be dire indeed. We stand to lose billions if indeed Donald Trump goes ahead and does what is being asked by these congressmen to do.